Thank you once more, Professor, for joining us. Well, first and foremost, we have heard and read a lot about your latest book, Collisions. Could you say just a few words about the contents of the book and the main thesis you present there?
Of course, yeah. No, I try in the book to provide historical context for this enormous and terrible war that's unfolding before our eyes and analyze it first along three separate axes. And that's why the title of the book is Collisions and not simply Collision. So one axis is, of course, a Russia-Ukraine axis. That's self-evident as to why that would be important. Second axis to me is not less important, and this would be the Russia-Europe axis. After all, Ukraine's crisis begins, roughly speaking, in 2012, 2013, has something to do with the European Union Association Agreement, Ukraine's European aspirations. Europe is a very important backer and supporter of Ukraine. And for Russia, much of the problem is where Ukraine fits or does not fit in Europe's security architecture. And then the third axis is a Russia-US axis, which takes us back in some ways to the Cold War, but also, of course, deeply into the 21st century, and is what gives the war something of its global configuration. That it is, of course, a European/Russian war or conflict, but it's also transatlantic and global in nature. So I look at the war across those three separate axes, which I think are all different. They all begin in different ways. They function differently, and it's my guess that each will have a different point of conclusion. It's one of the things that makes this war, I would say, so complicated to understand. Let me briefly sketch my four conclusions, and glad to elaborate on each of these 4 points. I conclude the book by making predictions, a dangerous thing to do
Yes.
in the moment that we're living through. And I think three of the four predictions that I make are reasonably strong today. One is a little bit more in question, and I know that you'll have further things to say about the fourth conclusion about the United States and about where the US is going. The first conclusion is that Russia's break with the West is both very deep and probably very long-standing. And this has occurred on the political level, certainly military level, but also is something that's happening on the social and cultural level, and is really almost without precedent in Russian and Soviet history, at least for the last 300 years. So that process, I think, has happened quickly over the last 2.5 years, but I think is going to really be a long-term feature of our basic environment. Secondly, and this is a very connected conclusion to the first conclusion, Ukraine is going to be a part of Europe and is going to be a part of the West. I think that will happen. I think in important ways this has happened already. And this is one of the things that the war means. And of course, it's not an accident that as Russia breaks with the West, Ukraine becomes a part of it, because there is something almost symmetrical, mathematical, or binary to this conflict in that manner. Thirdly, I do think that Europe, broadly construed, whether we're speaking of Poland, whether we're speaking of the Baltic republics, whether we're speaking of Western Europe or Southern Europe, is going to be defined by war, which has not been the case for 30 years, perhaps. It's a very common feature of European history. So either we're back where we've always been, and war is there in the middle of Europe, in the heart of Europe, or we're in some new territory, but it's a psychological shift that we have to make from a Europe that we tended to associate with peace after the collapse of the Soviet Union to a state of war that is not going to be short in duration. And then finally, I predict in the book that the United States is going to be strongly committed to Europe. I think that this is still likely to be true. Happy to elaborate on that, but I'm a little bit less certain of that conclusion than I was when I finished the writing of the book about a year ago. So those are the four predictions that I make, and I'll, sort of end the summary there.
Well, as you have noticed, predictions are quite risky always. So they are very courageous to write about predictions. But of course, your predictions come out of your experience as well as a diplomat practicing policy making. So I would have one more question about the book as such, because, well, predictions are very important, but do you recommend something? Are there any recommendations to
I
avoid
directly recommend.
the worst scenario? Yes.
No, I don't directly recommend anything in the book, but I think there are clear recommendations that follow from the argument of the book. One is, and this is, not a surprise, but it demands emphasis, is to take Russia's military aspirations very seriously. These are not small aspirations. Russia has, I think, radical plans for Ukraine and perhaps for the region at large. And also, Russia has a degree of capacity, less than it thinks that it has, but often more than we sometimes, or we in the United States, think that Russia has. So, to be very sober and serious about the kind of challenge that Russia represents, I characterize it in the book as a generational challenge. And that's, I think, the intellectual or policy mindset that we have to have. It's not about a little bit of territory here or there. It's about the very big questions of how Russia relates to Europe and the kinds of capacity Russia has for creating difficulties and problems in Europe. That's sort of one policy conclusion. Another policy conclusion is about what has failed in the past. And I think by understanding what has failed in the past, we can get a sense of what will succeed in the future. What failed in the past with Ukraine, going all the way back to 1991, are what I describe as half steps and half measures. So often US policy, I think German, French policy as well, was about getting rid of the visible problems and trying to get back to normal. So in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, Russian incursion into eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, there was a very, very poorly made diplomatic solution to that problem, known as Minsk diplomacy. And it really was a series of half steps, half measures, half promises, sort of half efforts. I think we know for a fact that this does not work. So if we wish to succeed, there's a certain need for boldness. There's a certain need for strong commitments. And once again, for taking this problem very seriously. And then finally, and I think that this is in a way obvious from points 1 and 2 in terms of policy recommendations, patience, the need to have patience. This is not a problem that can be quickly solved. It's not a problem that is going to be easily solved. It's going to be a messy, long, brutal, and difficult war. So if we are to succeed, we need to build in ourselves. I say this especially for the United States. I don't worry about Poland having the patience for this conflict. I think the patience is there. But if the United States is to succeed with its European partners and allies, it will need a lot of patience. That's not, judging from recent American history, is just not a given. The US was in Iraq for a while, it kind of lost patience. It was in Afghanistan for a while, it lost patience. I think what the United States cannot afford in this case is to lose patience. So we have to understand what patience means and make the political case for it and try to just make it as entrenched as possible.
Well, you mentioned Poland. That's very interesting. Unfortunately, yes, in Poland, almost no one understands that Russia has certain potential and capacities, as you have mentioned, and that is the biggest problem, in my opinion, at least. But however, do you think that in United States, in not only intellectual class in United States, but among the decision makers, other people who truly understand and comprehend the motivations of Russia and the patterns of behavior in international politics of Russia, of Moscow?
I would say on balance, the answer to the question is yes. We have one of the most skilled and capable of American Russia watchers in the US government. This is the director of the CIA, Bill Burns, who was ambassador to Russia in an earlier part of his career. I don't know if he's a Russian speaker, but he's studied very carefully, and I don't think that he's naive or badly informed about the kind of challenge and threat that Russia presents. I think President Biden is in the same place. Secretary of State Blinken, I don't think suffers from lack of understanding and naivete, and I would say the same for National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. For the Biden team, and I know that we'll get to the Trump team shortly, for the Biden team, the problem is not, I would say, lack of understanding or naivete. The problem is how they have to juggle all kinds of different priorities, which is different for Germany, different for the UK, different for the European Union, different for France, and I'm sure different from Poland as well. So there's the whole Asian theater, which is not yet a theater of war, but has that potential and has certainly caught the attention of American policymakers for the last 10 years. The U.S. has all kinds of commitments in the Middle East, which is a place of great stability at the moment. And Europe is, I would hope, still at the top of the agenda. So the question is not whether they will rush to compromise with Russia because they think Putin you're able to do business with Putin. That mentality may have been there in the past, but I think the war has swept that mentality away. The question is how they balance all these different priorities. And that's a genuine challenge. And that's where American attention could shift or could move. And that's, I think the closest thing that should be, or that's what should be given the closest attention at the moment. How do they prioritize? And I think in the case of the four policymakers I mentioned, Burns, Blinken, Sullivan, and Biden, they all in their own minds balance things a little bit differently. Of the four, I think Sullivan maybe has the strongest Asia focus. Blinken, Burns, and Biden, I think, probably have more of a European focus.
I see. And as you have already mentioned, we plan to talk about possible new administration of a possible new president if Donald Trump will be re-elected again for his second term. What would change? I mean, I have read, of course, your brilliant analysis, the article in the Wall Street Journal, but you present there some, different three scenarios as far as I remember.
Yes.
So first scenario is that nothing would change, right?
Right, which is very possible. If we think back to 2017, and I think the best evidence we have about a second term President Trump comes from his first term. So that's what we should analyze. Sometimes his statements are, very varied and difficult to follow for me. And so, I don't pay that much attention to the words, but I think it's important to pay attention to the deeds of his first term. Two countries entered NATO while Trump was president. US spending on defense toward Europe went up, it didn't go down. And Trump supplied Ukraine with lethal military assistance, the Javelin anti-tank missiles, which were really important at the beginning of the war. So, that is a record that Trump has, and that's a foundation for Biden administration policy. And it could well be, is likely to be the foundation for Trump administration policy. So that's not a journalistically interesting story to say that there's continuity from 2017 to 2021 to the present to the future, but it's not at all unlikely that that could be the case. What many people worry about in Washington, and I know in Europe as well, is that Trump would lose interest in Ukraine, that he would try to cut a deal with Putin, and that he would somehow destroy the transatlantic relationship. I think things would be difficult between the US and Germany and between the US and the EU under a Trump administration. That's built in, but that's not because of Ukraine, and that's not because of Russia. There are other issues that matter for those tensions. Would Trump have the instinct to cut a deal with Putin? He might. He suggests that he might be interested in doing that. But the real question is, could President Trump cut a deal with Russia? And I don't think he can. I don't think that Ukraine is necessarily going to march to the beat of an American drummer. If Ukraine disagrees, it will pursue its own course. And I don't think a country like Poland, if the United States were seeking some kind of agreement with Russia, would necessarily follow either. And I think that that is true for really all the countries of Europe. The countries of Europe will make decisions based on their own interests. And if that's a source of friction with the United States, that could be true. But I don't think that Europe is just going to give up on the war because Trump says that they should. So he may have all kinds of ideas, but I would be surprised if he were able to put them into practice. What I think is more likely in some ways is that Trump will say he can solve the problem of the war in 24 hours. In fact, he has said this a few times. I will comfortably predict that this won't happen, that he will not solve the problem of the war in 24 hours. So what happens in the 25th hour? And I think Trump will look at the war with a lot of frustration. He won't want to be seen as a loser. He won't want to be seen as weak. I don't think that Putin will make life easy for a second-term President Trump. And so with those frustrations and difficulties, he could respond by doing two things that the Biden administration has not been willing to do. He could say, go ahead to Ukraine, use American weaponry to make strikes on Russian territory. And he could start providing Ukraine with sophisticated weaponry that the Biden administration is unwilling to provide. In short, Trump could escalate rather than de-escalate. That is not impossible, not guaranteed to be sure, but not impossible. And to me, that's the scenario that needs more attention because it's not the one that most people are discussing.
Yes, a lot of people in Europe, but not only in Europe, even in Russia itself. You read the comments and opinions that a lot of them count on Trump that he will somehow de-escalate the conflict. But meanwhile, you even have mentioned in your article, as far as I remember, the question of using tactical nuclear missiles, right?
Yes.
So would it be possible within the escalation ladder?
I mean, highly unlikely. I wouldn't want to indulge in reckless analysis, but I don't think that Trump is going to play by the rules that other American presidents have played by. You see that in so many different areas, whether it's tariffs and trade. Originally, with the U.S.-China relationship, Trump didn't treat Europe as any previous American president had. So he likes to break the rules. That's part of his political brand. And so I would assume there that questions of weaponry might be questions on which Trump would break the rules. And so we've had Putin threaten a number of times since the fall of 2022, when the war was going badly for Russia. Putin has threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons. I can easily imagine Trump making that threat, even if he didn't plan to do it, as a bargaining chip, as a negotiating tactic, as a military tactic. And if he would do that, we would just be in a new chapter of the war. Using tactical nuclear weapons, I think we're pretty far from that in a potential Trump administration, but threatening the use, entirely possible.
Do you think that different personal conflicts between the politicians could somehow affect the US policy towards Ukraine? I mean, the stories about the relations of President Biden and his son as well with Ukraine, which were disseminated by Trump and his followers, and also, to say it very diplomatically, some disagreements between the Zelensky administration and let's say people close to Donald Trump.
Sure. No, that's a very, very important question. The Hunter Biden material is important on the American political right. It's an important story in the Republican Party, and it's one that's been given a great deal of attention. If you look at comments from the Trump family, they can be very negative toward President Zelensky. Maybe not so much Trump himself, but Donald Trump Jr., Trump's son, has made a series of nasty comments about President Zelensky. And there is, in certain corners of the Republican Party, this allegation that Ukraine is corrupt. It's not worthy of American support. If you would look at the American journalist Tucker Carlson, who is relatively close to Trump, he makes those kinds of claims. A number of people in the House of Representatives and elsewhere. So there is a kind of melody that's sung on the right that's an anti-Ukraine melody, and that matters. It's probably more powerful in a campaign year, especially with the campaign being a Trump-Biden campaign, and it's really about domestic American politics. I don't think it's about Ukraine. So I would, grant that as an important aspect, as a part of the picture, but I'm not sure how big of a part of the picture is. The reason I'm skeptical about it being so important is that the anti-Ukraine faction of the Republican Party just lost a huge battle politically. They tried to stop aid from going to Ukraine. You had the Speaker of the House, Republican, of course, bring that to the floor. It went through. I think it went through with Trump's approval. Then you had an effort to get the Speaker of the House out of the House of Representatives, out of the position of Speaker of the House of Representatives, and that too failed. And so I think, in my interpretation, Trump has recognized that supporting Ukraine is better for the Republican Party than not supporting Ukraine. And that has to do with the global situation and maybe also domestic American politics as well, where the kind of anti-Ukraine faction is really very, very small, certainly not enough to win elections. So there's always games being played by President Trump, former President Trump. That's how he operates. Ukraine is a part of those games, but I don't think that that's the driving force, even in Trump world, of the way Ukraine is looked at.
You have also mentioned in your article Trump's attitude towards Poland, towards our
Sure.
country. That was very interesting. I mean, is Trump going to have the same attitude to Poland after the Polish government has changed? Because, well, the times of Trump presidency, we had conservative government of Law and Justice Party. Now we have more or less left liberal government. Well, I understand that on the ideological level, Trump might be closer, let's say, to Viktor Orban and to other conservatives from Central Europe. But is he going to be so close with Poland, with its new government, with the liberal?
He will be less close. I think that's has to be the case. There was, exactly as you suggest, a kind of ideological affinity with the previous Polish government. But I think there's another dynamic at work, which makes it just a little bit more complicated. I think Trump senses that the United States is quite popular in Poland. And that's not the United States of Joe Biden or the United States of Donald Trump, is that the United States is popular as a friend of Poland. And so when he went to Warsaw, that was the first state visit to Europe that President Trump made in 2017. I think he was acknowledging that, and of course, he was given a very warm reception. And that's a bit of a circular thing for Trump. If he feels like he's liked, he likes in return. And I think he rightly understands that in countries like France and Germany, it's just a little bit more divided. What the United States represents, what the United States is as a partner, there can be more disagreement and maybe more skepticism about the United States. So if I were to think about this question from the perspective of the Polish government, obviously it's wrong to take any kind of side in an outside political election, and that's not what the government of Poland is doing. But if Trump is to get elected, to sort of advertise that Polish enthusiasm for the United States to the extent that it's there, and to use that for leverage on these kinds of issues, I think for the map of the world that Trump has, there are kind of good countries and bad, and Poland is one of the good countries, and so that's of course an asset for Poland if Trump were to be reelected.
Mhm. Well, and another question about Poland. There are a lot of discussions here in our country about the possible Russian military threat.
Yeah.
Do you think that, well, you write basically that Europe will be a theater of war as such in the coming years, but
Yeah.
do you think that, let's say, in the perspective of prospect of 2 or 3 years, in a short-term prospect, is there really a threat of war, of escalation for Poland as well?
I think that it's something we all have to debate in a way as much as possible. We can't be surprised as we were in 2022, and we certainly can't be surprised as we were in 2014. And so back then, it might have been easy to say, well, the annexation of Crimea, that's never going to happen, and this massive invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that's never going to happen. Many people said that, and they were wrong. So we can't allow that kind of mindset to prevail again. We have to cultivate a kind of intelligent pessimism when it comes to these matters. We need to think through what that might look like. For me, the necessary precondition of the war spreading beyond the territory of Ukraine is that Ukraine really start to lose the war. And we're not there yet. I don't think it's going to happen. It's not my assessment, but if it were to happen, and Russia were to lurch, westward in Ukraine, I don't think the scenario is one of Russia moving directly onto the territory of Poland or moving directly onto the territory of the Baltic republics. I think NATO membership matters. And I also don't see what Russia has to gain from even more territory in one of these countries, given the risks. I think what Russia would instead try to do, if it were really winning the war in Ukraine, is to divide and conquer when it comes to Europe, and to try to divide European countries into those that are so afraid of Russia that they would appease and make a separate peace with Russia. And those European countries, probably the Baltic states, Poland, Scandinavia, that have such fear of Russia that they would think of really acting on their own, not going through Brussels, not going through Washington, but taking matters into their own hands. If that were to happen, if Europe were to be divided and conquered in this manner, what you would have is just a weaker Europe and a weaker transatlantic relationship, less cohesion, less organization, less cooperation. And I think that that's an environment in which Russia would like to operate and to push, maybe to take more territory in Georgia, maybe to take territory or more territory in Moldova, maybe formally to annex Belarus. All of that is sort of possible, but contributing to this larger climate of fear, which Russia would try to exploit. That to me is bad enough as a scenario that we have to think carefully about what it means. And that's a justification, of course, for giving serious military aid and assistance to Ukraine. But I think where the analysis would become probably irresponsible is we would say, well, first Ukraine falls, and then it will be Russia marching on Warsaw. That I think is just not within Russia's capacities, probably not Russia's ambition, and not the right kind of worry. It's a somewhat more diffuse, more medium grade worry that I have in mind. But again, I would emphasize that worry is in its own terms bad enough.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned that a lot of people were surprised back in 2022 in February with the Russian intervention in Ukraine. But do you think that we could avoid it? I mean, the West as such. You remember the Russian proposals for negotiations from December 2021, yes, about the complex new architecture of security in Europe and so on. I'm not talking that the West could agree with the Russian proposals. I'm just wondering if the West could, well, let's say, pretend that it's ready for negotiations, and if that would help to avoid the war as such, the military solution.
No, I don't think by 2021 there was anything, whether pretending or not pretending, that could have gotten a different outcome or result. After all, I would say President Biden tried as much as he could in the first 6 months of his presidency to create an opening to Russia. He gave the green light to the Nord Stream 2 project between Russia and Germany. He met with Putin in Geneva in the summer of 2021, and his rhetoric was, I would say, very, very subdued when it came to Russia. He established strategic stability groups with Russia. I mean, what more can you ask for, really, from an American president in context at that time? And of course, that did nothing to prevent Putin's rush to war or march to war. I think going back in retrospect, and this is all fairly unlikely, but this is the best I can say as to what might have prevented the war. And this would have been a recognition not in 2013, 2014, but in, say, 2011, 2012, that Russia has these territorial and regional ambitions, and that because of these territorial and regional ambitions, it's necessary to provide sustained and comprehensive military support to Ukraine, to provide Ukraine's military the means to defend itself, or at the very least to make invasion very costly to Russia, and to do that before there was any threat on the horizon. That's, speaking the language of diplomats or of military strategists, is the language of deterrence. That's a classic Cold War concept. It's a concept that's been used to deal with Russia for a long time. It's what NATO is still using as a concept to deal with Russia, but to apply that concept seriously to Ukraine. Had there been a deterrent strategy for Ukraine in 2011, 2012, had it been financed, had it been given real texture and real substance, then I think we might have been able to prevent these kinds of wars and these kinds of hostilities. I think absent that, without that as an approach, there just was too little to stop Russia.
I see. Well, Professor, last question is about your possible recommendations for Poland, for the Polish government. Of course, I know that it's quite hard to recommend or advise something to the government of a country like our country now, and in our position and in our, let's say, geopolitical situation. Nevertheless, would you have any thoughts and ideas for Poland?
Well, there are three basic things I can think of for the success of Ukraine in the war. And one, I think, is built into Polish politics, and I think would be by definition, whether the government is center left or center right, or whatever kind of government Poland would have, and this would be long-term military support for Ukraine. So I don't think that recommendation really needs to be made because it's the consensus in Poland. So I'll concentrate on the other two recommendations, which are more difficult to put into practice. When it comes to Europe, whether it's the European Union, whether it's just a broader notion of Europe, Europe itself is a complicated entity at the present moment. You have countries like Portugal that are very distant from the war, and countries like Poland that are very close to the war. It is essential that Poland see its success as Europe's success and Europe's success as its success. And so it's a project to be pursued in tandem with all the different countries, the different political cultures of Europe, to have a common European imagination, a common European dialogue, a common European consensus on the war in Ukraine. And that may mean learning to speak in a somewhat less Polish way about the war or the conflict when one goes to European meetings or when one develops European ties and structures of affinity. But there's no way that Poland can succeed with this war on its own. It can only succeed with Europe, and that has to be a political project. That doesn't mean, mindless support for the European Union. I don't have anything particularly political in mind, but it's really developing this political imagination. Some of it is going to be persuasion, and some of it is going to be the give and take of politics. But it's really essential. I don't think Poland is doing badly at this at the moment. It's more a matter of doing it for the long term. And then in ways that we've already been discussing, to make the transatlantic relationship work as well. What does this mean under President Biden? I think it basically just means more of the same. I think the Biden administration looks at Poland as an extremely significant and powerful regional actor within Europe. I mean, the population of Poland, I believe, is about 30 million. I don't know what
almost 40, almost 40.
Almost 40. I don't know what the GDP of Poland is. It's not at the very top of the list in terms of population and GDP, but whatever those numbers mean, Poland's important within Europe is larger than those larger than those numbers, and I think that that's quite useful for Poland. And if Biden wins re-election, it's just something that you want to build on. And I know that for the Biden administration, Ukraine's success, is Europe's success, and the transatlantic relations success is a part of all of this. So it's not a changing of gears, but just a keeping going. The greater challenges come into the picture if Trump is elected. We've already discussed some of this. I think that as I mentioned earlier, I think Poland could have a particularly important role to play, but all of what I mentioned before is just going to get more difficult. The challenge is going to be harder rather than easier. Trump is going to, in his own way, a little bit like I was saying about Putin a moment ago, he could try to divide Europe in some respects into the countries that he likes, into the countries that he doesn't like, into the countries that help with China, into the countries that don't help with China, into the countries that are contributing to America's economic success as Trump sees it, and to the countries that are not contributing to that success, to the countries that are giving more than 2% of their budget to defense, and the countries that are not. That, if it happens, is something that Poland is going to have to deal with. And that, of course, will be a challenge. And then finally, to do whatever can be done to persuade Trump to see the importance of Ukraine, probably for himself. That doesn't hurt, but to see the importance of Ukraine for the American national interest. And that's, again, the work of persuasion, and it won't be easy with Trump, but I think it is doable. And I do think that Poland is probably positioned first in line among European countries to do that work of persuasion.
Mm-hmm. Professor Kimmage, thank you very much for this conversation, and let me invite you once more to talk in a detailed way about your book. I mean, it's fascinating for us to read it. I think we will elaborate on the book a little bit more if you find time.
Would be a pleasure. Would be an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you very much. And hopefully this scenario, which is actually quite terrible for us, I mean, for Europe as a continent, which you described there, is possible to be avoided somehow. Yeah. So let's talk next time also about that. How you here in Europe could avoid the most tragic scenario, which is described in your book as well.
Yeah, well, we think about these tragic scenarios not to make them inevitable, but for the opposite, to prevent them from happening in the first place.
Thank you very much once more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Till next time. Yes, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.